Okay, hello everyone. I'm Jay Perlman, co-chair of the Ocean Best Practice System, the OBPS, and also moderator for this session. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the conference committee team of Frank Muller-Carger. He's the chair, Paul Van Ruth, the program chair, Pauline Simpson, Ben Roberts, and many, many others. Without that team, this wouldn't be possible. I would also like to acknowledge our sponsors, the Ocean Ops Research Coordination Network, GOOS, and IODE. Now I would like to introduce Frank Muller-Carger, the workshop chair. Frank.
Thank you, Jay, and thanks everybody for showing up. It's good to see so many familiar faces. I'm Frank Muller-Carger, and I'm at the University of South Florida. I welcome you to the 6th workshop of the Ocean Best Practices System, or what we call OBPS, of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, or IOC. I'm going to serve as chair of this workshop. The OBPS is a global project sponsored jointly by the Global Ocean Observing System, or GOOS, and the International Oceanographic Data and Information Exchange, or IODE, both at the IOC. And this is set up to support ocean communities engaged in ocean observation, data analysis, and applications. This workshop has several goals, and they're really intended to help you develop the best practices that you need for your field, to promote their documentation, and to share them widely using the Ocean Best Practices System. Now, today's plenary will set the tone for activities that you have organized for your individual sessions, and that will take place over the next 2 weeks. We will hold a second instance of this particular opening plenary at 14 hours UTC today, October 5th, and a closing set of plenaries too will be held on October 19th. I'm now pleased to introduce Ben Roberts, who is our technical support lead for the workshop, and he will show you how to ask for help. At the end of this session today, he will also offer an introduction to the KikoChat platform that is the home base for the workshop, and to the team up calendar that is the guide for what is happening when. So thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Frank. And hello, everyone. I'm really happy and honored to be supporting you with all your tech needs for the workshop.
Oh. You muted yourself, Ben.
Yeah.
Sorry, you heard the beginning, right? It just somehow, there we go. Yeah, I just put a link into the chat for a tech support document, which can also be found inside of KikoChat and provides contact information and other information about how to access KikoChat, as well as how to reach myself and also Joe Mann, who's going to be offering some additional tech support. There's a tab that lets you find that document inside of KikoChat. It's just underneath the clocks at the top of the main room. Joe and I are also available on WhatsApp, and I'll put the link in there. We have a group tech line that we've set up, and I'll be hanging out in the main plenary room from time to time, this same Zoom line we're on right now. So if you see me there, they see a little red video icon to show that I'm there. Please feel free to drop in and see me anytime. And I'll be co-hosting all of the workshop cafes along with members of the OBPS organizing team. And I encourage you to join those as a way to continue your conversations about best practices, to cross-pollinate among the various themes you're going to be exploring, and to network with one another and the OBPS team. So I'll be back at the end of this to give you a guide through KikoChat and the team up calendar and other things. But right now it's back to Frank.
Thank you very much, Ben. We will now have keynote speakers who will review the history and the vision of the Ocean Best Practice System and talk about a regional implementation. The first keynote speaker is Rachel Przlowski of the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. The second keynote is Paul Van Ruth, the Senior Science Officer of the Australian Integrated Marine Observing System, or IMOS, which is part of GOOS. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jay. Now I'm just going to share my screen. And while I do that, in Australia, it's actually best practice to acknowledge our traditional owners. So I would like to take the opportunity to do that. I am currently coming from you from Bungendore, New South Wales, which is the traditional home of the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people. And I just want to acknowledge their role as our first scientists over here in this neck of the world. Now, can you all see that? It shouldn't be in presentation mode yet, but if I could get a verbal affirmative before I put it into,
Yes,
okay.
we can see it.
All right, so once I put it in presentation mode, I can't see anybody or the chat. So if I could just have anybody chime in if there's technical difficulties, I won't know about it. Now, all I've got is Frank over my notes section, so I'm just going to swing him over here. There we go. All right, so I'm going to set the scene a little bit for you all. I'm going to give you a bit of a history, very brief vision, and just talk about the moving parts of the ocean best practices system. I've got some unfamiliar names in the room that I haven't met before from all over this side of the world. And so I assume there's some of you in the room who don't actually know what we're talking about when we say OBPS, or Ocean Best Practices System. And so the goal of this keynote is to get all of us on the same page so that when we talk about it later on in this session and in some of your theme sessions later in the week, you'll actually kind of have this base knowledge and I'll be able to work forward from that. So what are best practices? Sorry, Frank, your icon keeps coming around my screen. I'm just going to drag you over there. That's much better. So we talk about best practices all the time, but it's actually a bit of a, it's not necessarily an established definition or something that's consistent across everyone. So we need to make sure that we do have that consistent definition. And Jay very kindly co-authored a highly collaborative paper where he set forward a definition that a best practice is a methodology that has repeatedly produced superior results relative to other methodologies with the same objective. Now, importantly, to fully elevate a method or a practice to a best practice, you have to have a community review, it has to be adopted, and it has to be employed by multiple organizations. Now, to make things more confusing, the OBPS, the Ocean Best Practices System, doesn't just contain best practices. It contains a whole range of practices, including methods, standards, guidelines, and best practices. Importantly, the OBPS is created by the community and for the community. So why use a best practice? Most of you, I think I'm preaching to the converted here, but I'll go through it anyways. Best practices are a very efficient use of our time. So you don't have to spend time developing a method, fine-tuning details of that method. You know there's something that's been used by the community and they've already had that learning curve in there. So it's a very efficient use of your time. There's collaborative opportunities when you employ a best practice. You can get together with other people that are using the same thing. You can share your data. You can do bigger and better studies, both spatially and temporally replicated. Improve systems interoperability. If you're working with digital infrastructure, having a consistent metadata standard and having a consistent way that data was acquired and submitted to an online system can really help with that interoperability. Comparing and collating data, from my perspective, this is one of the biggest things as an ecologist. You get data that are coming in very similar ways, and you can take what might be disparate data sets and actually instead compare and collate them so you can get larger regional scale studies and you can answer the bigger picture questions. There's greater trust in data, again, because these have been elevated to best practices. Often you'll have streamlined regulatory approval. So if you're seeking approval from regulators or from permitting agencies, they are very, they receive very well best practices when you have those in your proposals and your permissioning. And then finally, and for many of this is another huge draw card, there is a higher level of funding success when you can draw on a method that is considered a best practice. And don't worry yet, if you still don't actually know what the OBPS is, I will come to that eventually. I just wanted to give some context before I get to it. So the history of the Ocean Best Practice System itself started about 2014 with the IODE repository in Atlantos. In 2016, there was a working group formed from that on best practices. And in early 2017, we launched the first website, oceanbestpractices.net. Don't go there, it's no longer active as far as I know. And if it is, I don't want to see it. Later that same year, we had our first workshop. So this one was the same workshop now that we're in our 6th iteration of, was done in 2017 in person in Paris. At that same time, we also launched our Frontiers of Marine Science journal research topic that I'll talk about in a bit. Then we had the project adopted as an IOC project, co-sponsored by OOE and Goose. We had a large community paper that came out in 2019, and then last year, we submitted a project or a program to the UN Decade on Ocean Sciences, and that's called Ocean Practices. Okay, now we're getting to the meat of this talk. What is the OBPS? It is an international project supported by the IOC and co-sponsored by IOD and Goose. And its vision is to have agreed and broadly adopted methods across ocean research, operations, and applications. Now, I'm going to be spending the rest of this presentation briefly describing these 8 different features that are listed here on the OBPS. We have our 4 original capacities, which was the OBPS repository, journal, training, and user support. And we have some new capacities as well: task teams, ambassadors, International Annual Workshop. I will not be spending much time talking on that because you all are here. So I think that's quite self-explanatory what it is. And a little bit on the UN Decade of Ocean Sciences. This is not a comprehensive list, but it is kind of the main take-home points of what the OBPS consists of currently. The first cab, and arguably the oldest and most important one off the rank, is the OBPS repository. So if you are not familiar with this, there are 2 links right up there that you can plug into whatever spare monitor or mobile phone you have handy, or you can look at it after this workshop. The OBPS repository has 2 main functions. There's the search function and there's the submit function. And those are 2 slightly different interfaces, but they are linked together in the back. When you go to our main website, oceanbestpractices.org, you'll be able to see a link that kind of live harvests data from the repository. So you can see the number in there. When we took this screenshot, there were 1,720, and it gives you a quick link to be able to search and submit. So I'm just going to take you to those 2 functions very quickly. And I want to acknowledge Pauline Simpson, who helped me with this part and gave us some slides and some background data, some of which we won't cover, unfortunately. So this is the submit function here, and you get basically this screenshot here, which I'll show you in the next one, which comes up, and you can submit your practices, whether they be manuals, SOPs, guidelines, standards, and you can tag that with a whole bunch of different metadata. So the repository does require the full text upload and metadata input. Some people find that metadata a bit onerous, and it does take a bit of time. But it's really important to get that in there because it actually allows your best practice or your method to be searchable and accessible to a broad range of people that might not otherwise find it. So the other thing is that you can have a DOI assigned as well when you submit a method to the repository. This is appealing for a lot of people that have, I guess, the gray literature, might not otherwise have a DOI, and it can increase citability and the ability to detect impact for your best practice. So another example here is that the repository is very good in hosting, I guess, older or obsolete best practices or ones that can no longer be found. And so a really good example of this is the Fix 03 project, where the website itself no longer exists, but the best practice is highly used and cited, and the only place to find it now is in the repository. This is the search interface, and this is actually underpinned by a very sophisticated semantics and ontology. Sorry, I'm not saying that right, ontogeny. And this is what actually harvests from the metadata that you put in when you're submitting. So this allows you to search for various options here, and Pauline's actually highlighted some of the features on this. I don't have time to go through all of them, but what I did want to flag was this endorsed field that you can filter through on the left, and that'll actually allow you to filter through internationally endorsed best practices, and I'll go through that on a different slide in a moment. And then the repository also spits out a whole bunch of different analytics. So these can be done for the overall repository itself and the activity on it, or for individual methods and best practices, which is really, really useful if you're trying to measure the impact and uptake of your particular method. So these are just some examples of some of the metrics for the overall activity of the OBPS repository that we harvested in March 2022. So you can see in the map on the left there, it shows a heat map of the different providers and underneath that, the different users of the OBPS. And then that line graph just has a running average from 2017 to now of the monthly users. And you can see that it gradually does creep up. Something quite interesting, just another analytic that we could pull out here. This is the total number of users of the OBPS repository. And you can see right around 2017, unfortunately, it's quite hard to see, but in the middle of that graph is 2017. And that's when we had our first workshop. So you can see that right after that, we really started getting people using the repository. We started fine-tuning the details in it and the infrastructure underpinning it. So it was really nice to see that increased after that first workshop. Shows the impact of the workshop as well. Beyond the repository, we've got some other features in the OBPS. We have a journal research theme that we run through Frontiers of Marine Science. And that research theme is called Best Practices in Ocean Observing. So if you just run a search for that theme in Frontiers of Marine Science, you'll see it and you'll be able to submit and look at some of the other articles in that theme. At the moment, it has 43 articles in it. One of the benefits, if you submit to that theme, is that there is a discounted open access rate. I believe it's less than half of what Frontiers normally charges. And one of the benefits of publishing in the journal is that you are getting an internationally recognized and broad audience to share your data quality practices and information to. Another feature we have in the OBPS is training and capacity development. And there will be more on this later in the capacity development panel. So I urge you all to stick around for that. One of the main features I think we've done in this space over the last year is Ana Lara Lopez, Claudia, and Rebecca Zitun got together and convinced a few of us to do these modules. And so these are released on the Ocean Teacher Global Academy website. You can register for them. And each one of the modules goes through an element of best practices. So right now we have the first one, which is what is an ocean best practice. We have creating a best practice, and we have how to submit a methodology to the repository. So each one of these modules walks you through something. We will have a fourth one coming very soon, and that one's going to be on how to search for a best practice. And once those four are released, it'll be an entire course up on the Ocean Teacher Global Academy, and you'll get, I think, a certificate when that's finished. We have a bit of user support and outreach function in the OBPS. I guess the consistent highlight for this one is the newsflash. So I noticed that we've got my co-editor, Virginie, online as well, and she helps manage that with me. So this comes out every other month, has a range of different articles, updates from the OBPS steering committee, but also some feature articles, success stories, and other news from around the ocean community. At the moment, we have over 500 subscribers, and it is a very good opportunity to promote your method or other information related to the ocean best practice community to a very diverse international audience. So I would urge all of you, if you're not already, to please email newsletter@oceanbestpractices.org, just with a subscribe in the email line, and we will put you on our list and you'll get it every other month. A newer function that we have in the OBPS are these discrete task teams. So these task teams are assembled based on people that are interested in leading them and a known priority. So they are projects and they are finite and discrete, so they will eventually end. And at the moment, we have these four top ones: diversity, equity, and inclusion, value change analysis, and KPIs. We're looking at omics and eDNA, coastal observations in under-resourced countries, and then we have a fifth task team that's currently under development working on decision trees. We also, as I mentioned before, have a new project in the UN Decade for Ocean Science program, or maybe it's a program in a larger program, I'm not sure. I get program and projects confused in this. We will have more on this later in the third keynote in this session. So again, stick around after the break and you will hear a lot more about that. But this is a really exciting space. We're in the very early stages of planning it, and I look forward to seeing where it goes over the decade. So that's the OBPS. Those are all the different features. It was a very quick run through, and I apologize for that. It's just, limited time. But I would urge you to, again, to check out the website, oceanbestpractices.org. It goes through all of those in a little bit more detail. But again, if you have any questions, most of us with the backgrounds that I have right now are on the OBPS steering group, and you can either email us or get hold of us through the Kiko chat, or even in the chat, now once I'm done talking. But briefly, I just wanted to go through the impact of the OBPS and kind of set a little bit of a forward direction so you can see where we're trying to go with it. So since its inception, the OBPS is now an expected component in, sorry, not the OBPS itself, but we promoted best practices being an expected component in many project proposals. And we've got a really active ocean best practice community, of which we hope all of you are now a part of and will remain a part of. And it's allowed all these different sub-themes that you'll see in this workshop to come to fruition. So it's no longer just this broad spectrum of best practices are wonderful. We're actually drilling down into disciplines, regions, and different capacities, which is really lovely to see and really quite inclusive. We now have a global spread of users. So you can see the heat map of our users here on the right. And I will point out this doesn't filter for spam and bots, but so maybe take US and China with a grain of salt. But what it does show is that we do have a global representation. And interestingly, we are focusing some of our efforts on engaging Africa more, because you can see that they're probably less represented in the community of users than other countries and continents. We're trying to develop some training and workflow to find and develop best practices. And we have done that. So I'm going to actually show in the next slide what we've done with that. And then finally, we've done some Goose International endorsements. I'm going to whip through those very quickly because I am running out of time. So this is the infographic that shows basically best practices for best practice, how to develop a best practice, how to make a true one. And I can't go through this in detail right now, but hopefully we'll be publishing a paper on it very soon. There's 3 main phases here for how to develop a best practice. Most people just stick in this phase. They just develop the practice and release it. But to actually truly have a best practice, you've got to be inclusive with who you're actually developing it with, and you've got to have community review. And so that first phase and that third phase are extraordinarily important. Part of that community review could ultimately be elevating it to an internationally endorsed best practice, and the Global Ocean Observing System has this endorsement process now that's been supported by the OBPS. I won't read through all of these because hopefully this presentation will be made available offline and you can look through it at your leisure. But to be qualified for Goose endorsement, I just want to highlight that again, you have to have a rigorous community review process. That is something that is required. We are talking about how to have a national endorsement process, particularly in Australia and some other places. So I think the Goose example is going to be one of several that will be coming out over the next few years in regards to endorsed best practices. So at the moment, there's only 6 Goose endorsed best practices, and you can find those on the repository by using that filter function that I showed you before. And then looking forward for the OBPS. So my colleague Johannes put this together. He's going to be delivering this keynote in the Atlantic session. And I guess the take home here is that we want to have a global, sustained, and trusted hub of ocean know-how. How to do methods, how to find methods, how to create methods, how to actually collect robust and rigorous data and make that accessible to the general public and the scientific community. We are expanding our work with developing nations, remote regions, and indigenous peoples. We are looking forward to motivating and focusing a global conversation around best practices, and that's part of what this workshop is today. We want to encourage organizations for institutional uptake and to endorse what is best for them. We very much need to harmonize metadata and data infrastructures, make data fair, looking at a fair best practice, I guess. And we want to promote a federated network of methodological management systems and synergize best practice and standards. And that's working towards that convergence. So if you have 2 methods that are kind of the same, it's best to have one that's been agreed. And that's what we mean by convergence. So that is the OBPS in a nutshell. I hope you took something away from that, and I hope it provides a bit of context for what's coming up in the next keynotes and in the theme sessions.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That's quite an overview of OBPS and the accomplishments that have been extensive over the last 5 to 7 years. With that, I'd like to invite Paul Van Ruth to talk about the Australian national experience of best practices and moving forward with them. Paul, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Jay, and thanks for that great introduction, Rachel. So I'll share my screen now. Okay, so it's wonderful to be here with you all to be able to talk about this. I'm coming to you from Hobart, Tasmania, in Australia. As Jay mentioned, my name is Paul Van Ruth. I'm the Principal Science Officer at Australia's Integrated Marine Observing System. And I want to talk to you now about the way we use best practices in our program and why we feel it's really important for us to do that. So I'll just start first by introducing the program. So we're recognised as one of the 13 Goose regional alliances, and within that, we're regarded as a leader in best practice marine science observations and data management. This is in both the private sector and in government, and across industry and research and management and operations as well. So we're a national collaborative research infrastructure. We're funded by the Australian government to provide sustained long-term marine observations. And we run a co-investment model. So we use that funding with the significant co-investment we get from our partner organisations, which you can see on this slide here, to effectively double the total funds that we've got to run the program. So we're currently running more than 60 different facilities and sub-facilities, many of which you can see in this graphic here. And together, these are collecting observations on more than 50 different climate and marine variables. So our observations are integrated across scales, so from the coast across the shelf to the open ocean, and integrated across disciplines. So we're collecting information on physics, on the biogeochemistry, and on biology and ecosystems. Now, it's a condition of our funding that all observations we collect are made publicly available according to fair data principles. And this is done through the IMOS Australian Ocean Data Network. So with all of our observations, we make contributions to community management, legal and policy needs in Australia. So our observations and data are supporting operational services and the needs of research management and industry. And they're creating societal benefit at regional, national and global scales. So you can see the 5 different key societal benefit areas on the top right there that we're providing information for, and the 3 main uses of our data down the bottom there as well. So it's really important stuff that we're doing at regional, national and global scales. So we need to make sure that we're making the wisest investment we can of these funds that we get to ensure that we can keep doing this. So the big question is, how do we build resilience in our program to ensure we can continue to provide these critical services for our stakeholders and end users? And it really comes down to the foundations that underpin our program and help guide what we do. And I want to elaborate on those a bit further in the next slide here. So we've got our sustained long-term observations. And these are underpinned by 3 interconnected principles which guide our strategies. This is about maintaining relevance to maximise our impact, building trust through high standards and transparency, and fostering the capacity in our program to grow and evolve. And together, these are all really about ensuring that we're working as efficiently and effectively as we possibly can to maximise the outcomes that we can get from this funding for stakeholders and end users. So these three principles are underpinned by the plans and processes and procedures that we've got in our program, which direct our operations and really form the cornerstones of these foundations. And I'm not going to go into all of these now. I'm just going to focus on the key one that we're all here about today, which is the standardised best practice protocols. And I want to talk a bit more about why we think it's really important to use these to help us to build this trust that we need in our program. So at IMOS, all of our procedures and protocols are to be standardised, endorsed by IMOS and registered with Ocean's best practice system. This is a condition of receiving funding from us, and it's part of the contract that our operators sign up to when they want to get our funds to go and do something. So for us, this is everything from our calibrations. Your data will only be as good as your calibrations if you're using these instruments. Sampling and analysis protocols, but also data processing management and QA/QC procedures. And through this, we're looking for all of these documents to be registered with OBPS through us. That means that the DOIs are listed through our storage repositories. So when people search for these protocols, they come to IMOS storage repositories, which helps us to maximise the impact derived from our funding, as Rachel mentioned in the previous talk. This means that we've got another thing that we can show to our funding masters that is creating a benefit from the funds that they're providing to us. And you can see the website for the repository down the bottom there. If you want to go in and have a look at that, and I might, if I've got a bit of time, I might go through to that later. So how do we get to our IMOS endorsed best practices? They're collaboratively developed and refined by our IMOS community in discussions with relevant experts in the fields that we're interested in. And there's a few different types that we've got. We have best practices that are developed around established and recognised practices. So, for example, our Southern Ocean Time Series and our shelf mooring arrays have developed their practices around the IU's QUARTOD protocols. And our standardised data processing pipeline for a lot of our data includes the IU's Net CDF checker to make sure that the data is conforming to climate conventions and marine conventions. And we have other practices that have been developed through initiatives, so newly developed practices through initiatives funded by IMOS that are now either accepted as best practices or have been used by other organisations as foundations to develop their own best practices. An example of this is the IMOS animal tagging protocols, which are now been adopted by ANABOS and endorsed through Goose. An example of the second type is the IMOS ships of opportunity bioacoustics, which other organisations have used as a foundation to develop their protocols around bioacoustics. And I'll just mention here as well, we run a BGC Argo facility, and those protocols have also been Goose endorsed. So I mentioned that all protocols for us need to happen this way. We're moving that way. We're not there yet. We've got at the moment 7 protocol videos and 38 community practices on Ocean's best practice. So, I'd say we're maybe 70% to where we want to be. But it's, as I mentioned previously, it's a condition of the contract to get funding from us to do the work that these need to be provided. So we're chasing those as we go. And I just want to run through a few of the different protocol videos and community practices that we've got in Ocean's best practices. So these are examples of some of the protocol videos that we have, and they're training videos. And the benefit of this for us means that because we're a national program, wherever these samples are collected around the country, we can be confident that they're being collected in the same way according to our processes. And that's a really valuable thing for us. It standardises what we're doing, which is really important, as you'll see in a few slides' time. And if you click on one of these, you can get additional information. You can go to the YouTube section. I've just got people over the top of my notes here. Oh, well, that's all right. You can see who it's been published by. You get information on the maturity level as well of this training video, and a citation too. So of the 38 community practices, there are a lot of different types that we have. So this shows here, we've got one for our Southern Ocean Time Series moorings, which is just quality assessment and control report for temperature over a period of time. And then we've got a document here that outlines the delayed mode QA/QC best practice manual for our ocean gliders, which are run nationally and deployed in different parts around the country. One thing I'll mention is that, as you can see here, we have different versions in the repository. So as our protocols are refined and updated according to new practices, we then refine the manual that we've got with the new version to incorporate those to ensure that everything's up to date. Another thing I'll point out is that we provide protocols and reports, quality control reports for different deployments as well. As you can see here, this is for the East Australian Current Deep Water Moorings Array, one for a deployment from 2016 to 2018, and then another one for the next deployment from 2018 to 2019. So if there have been changes in processes between those different deployments, that information's here and you'll be able to track that in the quality checking. That's really important in building trust, because that's around transparency about data quality information. And I'll talk about that a little bit further in a sec. I've got a bit of time left, I think. So I'll just do a new share. Let me find what I'm looking for here. Can you all see that now? The repository?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the IMOS repository on the Oceans Best Practices system. And you can just see some of the other submissions that we've got here as well. We've got details of protocols for using ship SST for remote sensed SST validation. Here's our bioacoustics QA/QC document, quality control for real-time meteorological and sea surface observations. We have a radiometry community of practice, so there's a whole lot of different protocols and procedures that we have detailed in our repository, and I'd encourage you to go and have a look at those. If I go back now to my other one. Okay. So just to sum it all up here, I want to highlight the benefits to us of building trust through best practices and why it's really important for us as a program to make sure that we're doing this. There's a few different ways that it really hits home. Firstly, and a lot of these Rachel's already mentioned in the previous talk. Firstly, operators unambiguously understand their expectations. They don't have to go searching for protocols to go out and do what we need them to do. They've got IMOS endorsed, standardised best practice protocols that they can find with findable documentation and regular updated training that they can undertake. That's good for our operators because it means that they're not wasting time trying to hunt around and find these things. And it's good for us because it means that we're getting standardised protocols and procedures to get the data that we need. Secondly, it means users of IMOS data can be confident that it's of the highest possible quality. The data for them is readily accessible in standard formats that makes it easier to use. And that's a real benefit for us because if somebody wants to download the data from the East Coast of Australia and the West Coast of Australia and the South Coast of Australia and combine it all together, they don't need to be trying to muck around worrying about whether it matches up and how to match it up. It's in a standard format, so it should all match up quite nicely and they should be just able to get on with their analysis a lot more quickly. And the really important one for this is the transparency in data quality information, from calibration to QA/QC and data management. So if somebody is worried about or wants to know about the quality of the information that they're getting from IMOS, they can track everything that's been done for the collection of that data from the calibration of the instruments right through to QA/QC and data management. and it's transparently available for them. And that really builds that trust. That's a big advantage for us because it means that we know that users are going to come and use our data. We don't need to divert funds to spend time convincing them to use it. They know the quality of the data they're going to get from us. They know that it's easy to use. It's in standard formats, so they're going to come and use it. Thirdly, it means funders can be confident that their investments will generate impact. As we build that trust, it builds our reputation for doing quality work, best practice work, that users will take up and use in ways that will have impact and benefit society. This is the sort of thing that funders want to see. And by building this trust, they can be confident that this is going to happen. And a last one that I really want to touch on, I guess, is that using best practices and standards provides certainty in the type of information that is required, but also the ways in which it needs to be collected that can help promote investment in sensor and hardware development, which is often a bit difficult and tricky to try to facilitate. So by operating with these principles, a big part of which for us is using best practices, it really allows us to make sure that we're getting the best we can from the investments that we make for our stakeholders and end users. And it means that we can be really proactive in our thinking and forward thinking and focus on continual improvement, which is only going to benefit everyone in the long run. And with that, I will leave it there. And if I've got time, maybe some questions.
Well, thank you, Paul. And you're right on time, which is very good with a very informative discussion. IMOS is certainly leading the global community in many of the things that you're doing. And it's very, very interesting to understand and appreciate. I'd like to move on now to the next session. This one is an interesting one. It's called Dialogue of Ocean Community Priorities. Now, what does that mean? Many of our workshops, there are lectures, but lectures can also be known as death by lectures. So we like to take the opportunities of meeting each other and sharing ideas. And this session, which is going to be led by Ben Roberts, will in fact address the agenda that we're talking about, but also how do we have dialogue of ocean community and set priorities. This will share your priorities and give you an opportunity to meet with others at the meeting. Ben, I turn the floor over to you.
Thanks so much, Jay. So we're going to be moving into 3 sets of breakout groups with 3 to 4 people. Maybe occasionally there'll be just 2 of you. They're going to last 9 minutes each. You'll see an 8-minute timer, and then I get a 1-minute warning, but stay for that full minute with your group. And you'll have 2 questions to answer together. So you can each go around and answer the 2 questions and maybe have a little bit of time to reflect together after you do that. But do try to manage your time since they're short little groups. So we're calling this a participatory mixer also, just kind of a way to, to get to know. Hopefully the breakouts will mix you perfectly, but you might be with some of the same people more than once. But to get to know some people or reconnect with people you already do know. So here are the questions. I've just put them into the chat. The first is, what big challenge do you bring to this gathering? And the second is, what do you hope to get from and give to this workshop? And so I'm going to go ahead and open the breakouts up in just a second. I want to make sure we have a good mix, as it looks like a couple people have dropped off. I'm going to pause the recording. We don't need to do that. And so in between each breakout, you'll come back to the main room briefly. I'll reshuffle the groups and send you back in. We won't be doing any talking during that. When we come back after the third one, we'll have a little bit of sharing in the chat about what's emerged, and we'll do a word cloud, the first of several. So I'm just going to pause the recording.
We now have the honor of keynote presentations from Vladimir Ryabinin and also Ashwini Satner Vladimir is the executive secretary of the Intergovernmental Oceanic Commission, the IOC of UNESCO, and has been a remarkable leader over the years in the Ocean Decade, but also in his support of best practices, and we appreciate that. Ashwini Sathnur is in the Scientific Marine Research in UNESCO, the Ocean Decade Laboratories, and she's been working in the Zero Hunger opportunities and challenges in the United Nations World Food Program. And we're very, very pleased to have both of them. Vladimir, I'd like to turn the floor to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jay. You know, I will be sharing my screen. And, you know, I have to start by saying that, unfortunately, Jay, this is the first time that I disagree with you. Well, I haven't done the necessary for the best practices. Still needs to be done. And, you know, I'm still discovering the best practices. Indeed, the work is quite, I would say, voluminous, and preparing for this talk, I realized that we can do really more. And I think this is, if it's not a message for everyone, probably message back to me, but, you know, so I'm now sharing my screen, and, you know, I just wanted to present to you the motivation for the decade, and, you know, and this, I think, also applies to best practices. So, of course, everyone wants to live normally, which is very particularly true now during these difficult times. And the state of the ocean is actually a barrier. So in order to implement the noble ideas of sustainable development, we need to really do something with the ocean. And what we need to do, it will be presented very soon. So, you know, I would like also to say that this imperfect world manifests in the sustainability of observations. If we compare the observations in the ocean and also meteorological observations, in this excellent study, Eurogoose showed that they are our ocean observations are much less sustainable than, for example, meteorological observations. We can foresee problems in 2-3 years, and I have to say that this analysis was done before the COVID. Now I think the numbers will change and will become even more dramatic for the ocean observations. So that was the motivation for the Decade of Ocean Science. That was proposed to United Nations in 2017, and we had worked before that roughly 2 years to first of all give birth to the idea and then shape it a little bit, and then the vision I think was compelling for the United Nations. The science we need for the ocean we want, but here ourselves we have to actually ask our question. So what is the science we need? We ourselves, I think, and I will answer this question at this slide. The science that is needed to manage the ocean sustainably. That would be for me the answer and the motivation for the future work. So what it means to manage the ocean sustainable, you know, we are moving towards sustainable ocean planning that opens actually huge opportunities in the ocean economy, in dealing with climate change, in biodiversity, but this is going to be implemented through different ways of managing the ocean: coastal zone management, maritime special planning, protection, establishment of marine protected areas, management of fisheries, aquaculture. The whole work on climate change also is focusing on this is basically a way of managing the ocean. For that, we have to develop policies, practices, also deliver real-time services, early warning systems, and of course, we need to develop the capacity. So that's basically what we need to do under the decade and beyond the decade. And the science that comes from the decade is a helper in developing various elements and then integrating them into the system of sustainable ocean planning, sustainable ocean management. So where we are in this process, we have now conducted 3 calls for decade actions. 2 of them were completely analyzed, and in the result, we have some addition to the scope of decade activities: 44 programs, 193 projects, standalone projects, of course, interacting with with the decade, 62 contributions. This is currently the scale of the decade, the largest undertaking in the ocean science in the history of this civilization. And it is what is important and resonating with me is that it's not just the kind of our traditional science. I used to be kind of a mathematician and involved in physical oceanography. That would I will call hard science. But this is also very much social science, and mechanisms of co-design of science as well are developed, including the best practices. So many programs resonate with me, empowering women, empowering early career ocean professionals, and the speaker after me is going to develop on this, I think, more. And of course, we have also some infrastructure. I have to attract your attention to the 2 decade coordination officers, because infrastructure is already quite rich, despite the funding is not. And the data sharing and ocean observations coordination officers are actually very much involved in the development of best practices. So also, I would say that the informal working groups that we have in the decade, focusing on monitoring and evaluation, focusing on innovation and technology, on communications, on data, involvement of the private sector, and also the forum itself, the decade forum, are basically a way of exchanging best practices. And this is, I think, an infrastructure that is already working, bringing fruits. And on top of that, we also have a decade best practices program that was endorsed, and it is led by the IUD office. And there are many partners in this, which I indicated on the slide. And basically, I think what I like in this particular program, there are so many programs that I even don't know them all now. But this one, which I also don't know too well, is actually that we have to really put on the surface a mechanism of discovering and sharing best practices to develop the methodology for that. And I think this is very, very important because, you know, the thing is that this is my last slide. You know, we already created a positive transformation in the ocean science. This is achieved on the basis of merging science, technology, bringing in economy that is actually very much stimulated by the ideas that were expressed in the deliberations of high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. Very much we're bringing into the design and also in the consideration and also in our friendship, the ethical considerations. So this is all kind of mixed and used in co-design of new programs. But with that, I think we will be hopefully able to very strongly contribute to starting to manage the ocean sustainably and escaping the crisis that exists now in the ocean health. But, you know, because of that, I think I would like to throw to you a challenge. Please do think and help us to maximize the effect of best practices that are actually originating mostly in the domain of ocean observations and data exchange, using certain principles like FAIR principle, for example. But, you know, for us, it is very, very important to, I think, maximize the potential of best practices for moving forward the decade itself. The challenge there is the following. So because we don't have a funded organization of the decade, we are creating a bottom-up movement. People are motivated and significant resources are already engaged of the order of $1 billion US. But, you know, basically people bring to the decade what they would like to achieve. And now the biggest challenge is for us to see how we can converge to the system of managing the ocean. That requires design, that requires resources, that requires also moving forward towards bringing this energy to ocean economy and also spreading that energy resources towards solving issues related to climate change, loss of biodiversity, reduction of poverty. And I would also like to say that ocean science in the decade is also a peace building factor, which is very important personally for me. So that potential is really mighty. But, you know, my impression is that interaction of the best practices community with your technology that you developed, with the infrastructure of the decade will be very, very promising. And I think we should discuss it with the Decade Advisory Board and Decade Coordination Unit and see how we can maximize that interaction towards successful implementation of the decade. That's all I wanted to say, and intentionally short. And I think we can discuss things after the presentation number 2, which I really expect with great anticipation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. I think you bring to us 2 very important messages, that within the decade and its creation of real capabilities in the ocean, best practices play an important role. And you've also focused us on sustainability. Just don't worry about the observations alone or the data alone, but understand how they impact long-term the sustainability of the ocean and our environment. And those are very, very important messages that we appreciate. I'd like to turn now to Ashwini Safner to talk about the perspective of the decade from an early career ocean professional and from somebody who's spent a lot of time with our heart in this to make it successful. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, the first step in the creation of ocean best practices is standardization, and which leads to innovation culture and creation of inventions and breakthrough inventions. And I have worked on telecommunications technologies, which is 5G technologies such as digitalization, and which has been adopted by multiple countries and has been launched in the countries also. So the facilities and services provided via digitalization could be applicable for ocean observation systems also. And creation of best practices based on the telecommunications 5G technologies inclusion into the ocean best practices would be a feature which I would wish to work on. And I'm also currently working in progress on that. So the platform for ocean best practices is the ultimate and ideal solution for the portfolio system of these observation mechanisms and implementation of the latest technologies such as digital technologies and also blockchain technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, observation systems such as satellite communications and air interface, also aviation, aerospace, everything could be included in these features and applicable for future next steps. So that was my key observations and takeaways from this workshop also. Thank you so much for providing this wonderful opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. I'd like to just suggest to open the floor for 2 or 3 minutes for any questions, and we can put them in the chat if you'd like, or you can raise your hand and we're happy to have you verbally pose the question. The floor is open.
Frank?
Yeah, I thank you very much to the speakers and Executive Secretary Ryabinin. I have a question for you. You compared the issues in oceanography with meteorology. And one of the challenges that I think we have is that in meteorology, really what people focus on, and they have done it very well to predict weather, they focus on, I think, 6 variables. And in oceanography, we have hundreds, if not thousands of different variables and methods, and there's no standards that we have for many things yet. And so I think that's part of the problem. So I was wondering how the IOC could help in identifying a minimum set of variables for physics, for chemistry, for biology. This may not be very palatable to many people, but if we don't focus on very few variables that we can measure very well everywhere and very often, it will continue to be difficult to make sense and predictions for the ocean. So can the IOC help with this?
You know, Frank, you called me executive secretary. Let me call you professor then. You know, so you know, I have to say that you know, Frank is basically, it's not a question; it's a statement by the person who is definitely very very deeply involved in the design of the global ocean observing system. And definitely we also have best practices for essential ocean variables. I would say, Frank, that essential ocean variables would be that minimal set, because they're based on the concept of feasibility and necessity. So, and indeed, you're absolutely right. You know, in meteorology, we have to deal with variables that are important for weather prediction, and then they are translated into domain of climate, and that is all. And here in our business, we basically deal with the living ocean. So, and that is a totally different ball game. So indeed, IOC is developing standards. What is very important, that we have to embrace indeed a lot of variables. But what is important in this process, that we have to focus on what is available, feasible to us, much less than in meteorology. Also because of the fact that IOC, despite it is an intergovernmental mechanism, is based on a decision or resolution rather of the of UNESCO. But it does, we do not have any convention behind us that forces, obliges member states, countries to make observations. That is the big difference. I think we need to move forward to creating such a convention. And the conventions on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction are a step forward in that domain, despite there may be some issues. And manifestation of very conventions in climate change, biodiversity, I think should have an extension to the ocean science, ocean observations, and now probably also to ocean management. So that is what we're trying to create in the decade. And this is, it is starting to resonate more and more. And we have now, for example, political declaration of the Lisbon conference that highlights the importance of ocean science. I see the decade for basically preserving the ocean. And that's the kind of political direction of our movement that also should involve a set of variables that we need to protect and develop. And when we recently started to generate the State of the Ocean report, we painfully realized that we are mostly able to represent the state of the ocean in the coastal waters, in some of them, also in areas that are not so important, but you know, the important areas with higher biodiversity, biggest changes are not covered well. So this is basically a state of crisis that we need to recognize and move forward to kind of eliminate.
Yeah,
and Frank, you know it better than I do.
Yeah, there's certainly many challenges in this discussion that we can look forward to. Venkat, we have just time for one last question. Venkat, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Vladimir. Thanks to everyone, and good morning for me here. I have a question which we have been discussing. I just spoke to Frank also. I'm also at the other side with the WMO. The challenge for us to expand the observation, to have quality data and fair, we look for a proper census. That's what OBPS talks about, having the repository of all the best practice. Now, the challenge for us is cost of sensor. Why, even in spite of all these efforts, we didn't see a phenomenal growth or expansion of the observation by various countries is the cost of sensors. And also, ocean is such an environment, anything you do, the cost is exponential, ship cost and such things. The technologies also need to be developed in a different way. But the sensor part, we need to look at it when you talk about essential ocean variable. How do you differentiate? One is a high quality sensor, which normally any oceanographer prefers. That makes a whole data per se, cost of our data is so expensive now. And it's okay, we have been using that. It is not affordable for others who want to do it and get a feel of this information. With these experts available, this is the right forum to think of maybe a 2-tier system, or WMO is trying to adopt a 3-tier system, where in the topmost there is a high precision sensor meant exclusively for calibration purpose. Second is medium one, which currently being used. Third could be developed by the startup company. We can allow that. That is the one way OBPS can support this startup, because recently I came across a startup working on some of the biological and marine chemical data collection they are working. But this need to be evolved to encourage our expansion of the network, what we are discussing. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's very good. Well, very, very good. And I thank both the questioners and the executive secretary. I'm not a professor though, so I'll have to nudge in that direction. But one of the things that maybe wasn't mentioned, Vladimir, in your presentation is the essential element of capacity development, or we'll call it capacity sharing in the Arctic. And I think that's something that we feel in the Ocean Best Practices is an essential part of propagating the development of practices and then the adoption of practices. And so we have now a panel session on capacity development, which is a very good segue to the two very good keynotes that we just heard. And with that, I would like to introduce two people to start the process, and they'll introduce their own panel. Juliet Hermes of the South African Environmental Observation Network, and also Virginie van Dugen Vogels, who will join her in an initial presentation, and then we'll open the floor to the panel for discussions. Juliet, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jay. I'll hand over to Virginie to start us off.
Thanks, Juliet. Just trying to get this view slideshow. So, hi everybody. So this is a short session about the development of best practice and interoperability, globalization of best practice, and capacity development and curriculum for formal education. But basically, so this session is going to be translated also in the Atlantic session, and this is just an opening for broader discussion at the end of this panel session. So basically, what is capacity development? So capacity development is about transformations that empower individuals, leaders, organizations, and societies. So if something does not lead to change that is generated, guided, and sustained by those whom it is meant to benefit, then it cannot be said to have enhanced capacity, even if it has served a valid development purpose. So there are different levels to which this can be approached, the individual, organizational, systemic, but mainly what we want to look at is at the level of organization and from national to regional and global. And in each of these levels, we might think about a different approach or a more specific approach because those different levels may have different needs. And we need to also understand why we're doing this. So there's different processing, different steps that we can view this capacity development process. And this can be perhaps adapt to each level. So in terms of tools, there's different tools that are already in place. So we don't want to reinvent the wheels, and we want to look at what is already there and building from it. But what would be good also to be added as different tools. And also what is important to mention here is about monitoring the whole process. So to look at how it is going over time and to have some sort of sustainability in the process. What we want to consider perhaps today is two types of capacity development in the context of best practice. So first is actually best practices for capacity development, and on the other hand, capacity development of best practices. So, and I invite you actually to read that paper from Tapa et al. In 2019, quite interesting one. But this is more about capacity building. So there's really a difference between capacity building and capacity development. Capacity building is basically going from scratch. But here we're more talking about developing from something that is existing. We have methods there based in ocean observing system, for instance. But what we want to do perhaps is going to develop from what is there and developing further to have more sustainable approach as well. So in terms of best practice for capacity development, so this definitely in ocean science, kind of loads of work there. And there's perhaps more work than what is available in terms of capacity. And so to look at for balancing this imbalance between needs, demands, and capacity, we need to develop some tools to improve this capacity, whether it's in terms of skills, resources. Resources is always something that is actually mainly an issue. And according to what is needed. Make this tool available and share what other communities, like how other communities are doing, and share that knowledge so we don't reinvent the wheels. And then I will go and pass this to Juliette, who will further explain to you about the process.
Thanks, Virginie. So the other thing there that we show really is how important co-design is in terms of capacity development. So, you know, in the past, often what you would have is people who would have capacity development as a tick box for a funding application, right? For these large European or American funding applications, you would have to show that you've done some sort of capacity development. And so they would just write something, people would just write something up without actually thinking about the needs of the region, the country where they were going to do this capacity development. And so, you know, what we're talking about here is the kind of capacity development that's co-designed with the people who you're developing the capacity of. So an example of this is like training in how to use the latest technology on the market. So, you know, as an example, gliders, you know, you might just write a proposal and say, oh, well, we're going to train whatever country in using gliders. But, you know, ultimately, how sustainable is this? And, you know, how can we shift this to actually doing some training as an integral part of a comprehensive program which addresses capacity issues on how to use the technology, but the technology that's best suited to that particular organization or country's goals, not the one that's suited to your funding proposal. And also, how can this be embedded in sort of personal development plans, and how you can incentivize that the trainees then become trainers, and also their we've changed slides. How do we then retain the capacity which has been developed into the correct positions? Okay, thanks. So if you go to the next slide, just briefly, the other side of things that we're looking at in this panel and that we'll be looking at throughout the discussion and the workshop is capacity development for best practices, which is something a little different to best practices for capacity development. So in this case, we're looking at, say, best practices for process content in formal undergraduate and graduate courses. How do we integrate best practices into that? How do we teach that? How do we teach it? And it would be of real value if we could get some guidance from this out of the discussions. And also if we consider, you know, what formal courses are there globally out there in terms of, you know, ocean work, and are best practices already being taught? And would it be possible to perhaps create a module or a MOOC that can be used by these particular courses? So if you go to the next slide, just to really finish up on this presentation, you know, the game is changing. We know this. And so how do we change with it? COVID's really shifted everything. It's left a huge gap in our observing systems that will never be recovered. But it's also meant that we've had to be innovative about how we do things. And this has resulted in a real shift in capacity development practices. So people, you know, people are being empowered to take on more responsibility, especially during COVID when travel wasn't possible. You know, technicians in under-resourced countries where there were key observing stations, they weren't able to have people come and visit and do the actual work. So they had to be trained to do it themselves. They had to be trained remotely. They had to be empowered, and they had to take on responsibility. So we've also seen that access to training courses has really opened up through virtual meetings. But is this as effective? Is doing everything virtually as effective? You know, how will we know? We'll see in time. But it's not only the impact of COVID that really makes a difference to capacity development, but yeah, I don't want to sound really old now, but it's the new generation as well. This kind of instant gratification, the short attention span, 280 characters, and the need for visualization. You know, should we really be adapting our courses and our capacity development to cater for this new generation, or should we actually be developing capacity in how to focus better and how to have more hands-on training? So these are just really some thoughts for the discussion for the panel session. If you go to the next slide, it's a lot of words, but I just put up some points for the audience to maybe think about, because I think we're going to open the floor now. We have some panelists here, and I'm going to ask them. I don't know which panelists actually have arrived for this session, so perhaps I can ask them to turn on their cameras. We were due to have Virginie Suchana Apple-Chavanich. I don't know if she's made it. Talon Rimmer and Johanna Diwa, and also Wulan. And I think the other panelists are for the Atlantic session this afternoon. Before we go to the panel session though, I did ask Ben to do a quick word cloud thing just to get people to think about the two different types of capacity development that we're looking at: capacity development for best practices versus best practices for capacity development. So Ben, before we go into the panel discussion, I don't know if you can do that.
Just maybe do you want to stop the screen share, or
yeah, can do that. Ginny.
So I dropped a link into the chat for the word cloud. So if you can click on that, and then you'll see the prompts. We're going to do 2 rounds of this. So the first one is going to be, what are the 3 main things when considering sustainable capacity development for best practices? You can go ahead and enter your data for that, and I'll share my screen. You can see what's coming up.
While we're doing this, I forgot to mention, apologies, and perhaps Johanna will when we go on to the talk through the panel, is that, you know, throughout this workshop, there are a number of sessions focused specifically on capacity development. And I think that just really highlights that that's really the top of people's agendas right now. And Johanna, I think maybe while we are doing the word cloud, you can just do a little promotion for your session with the time and the date.
Yes, well, thank you, Juliet. I'm really excited about this panel discussion because it's going to provide perhaps some of the starting questions that we can also take up in the capacity development thematic session, which will be tomorrow. I think it's at 1 o'clock UTC. I hope that people can join. We invited speakers who are direct beneficiaries of different capacity development programs, and also organizers or providers of capacity development programs, and to talk about some of the best practices that they can share. And then we're going to have a panel discussion on the second part of the session, wherein we will gather some insights, reviews from respective communities of practice, and then an open discussion after that. In fact, yes, perhaps some of the highlights from this panel discussion will be taken up during the open forum tomorrow. So yeah, please sign up and join us. Thank you.
Thanks. Ben, can we maybe try the next question now? So the next question is really to think now, that was capacity development for best practices, and now we're looking at best practices for capacity development.
That's just the same link. You should see an option if you clicked on the link in the chat now to go to the next question. People not seeing that?
Is it not the same question twice, or is that just me?
Well, they're almost the same. Oh, here we go.
They kind of reverse.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the idea behind doing this was to get people to really think about the differences that we're talking about. So best practices for capacity development, and then capacity development for best practices.
Right.
So while people are just finishing that, I think perhaps then we'll open the floor for questions. And I'm only seeing, I don't see anyone else with their camera on from the panel. I thought I saw Talon here.
Talon's here. Hold on. Let me just grab him and move him in. Hold on. And there was one other person I think you mentioned, Suchana, right? I'm not sure if they're here. Ah, yes. Okay. You need to turn your video on though, Suchana.
And also Wulan, are you part of this morning's panel, Wulan?
Hi, hello.
Hi. Yes, there we go. Okay. So perfect.
Yeah, I'm here.
There we go.
Great. I am not seeing any questions in the chat. So perhaps what we can rather do is look at, so some of the questions or the thoughts that I had prepared. And so I'll address maybe one of these, and one in particular that I know Talon was possibly able to speak about is really this other side of capacity development. So capacity development for best practices, and how we can give guidance on the best way to do this. You know, can we get process content in formal undergraduate and graduate courses? What way forward? I see there's a, yeah, okay, so Jay, how can best practices be embedded in academic training? So any thoughts on that? And then we'll go to Steve's question.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for the presentations. Hi, everyone. My name's Talon. I'm one of the ECOP OBPS ambassadors. A lot of acronyms in a row. I suppose with regards to the question, why I thought I could speak to this potentially is because I am now in grade 20 or in a grad school currently. And I was thinking a lot about when we were talking about OBPS and the presentations before, How do we get people in like this involved in curriculum and people to use OBPS resources? And from my general experience, and I acknowledge there are professors in the room right now who could probably speak to this even better than I could, so feel free to chime in. But a lot of the things that I've seen in terms of getting something integrated into a class or a course and widely accepted is through internal champions. It's through direct contact with folks who are willing to work closely with OBPS and develop these practices in a kind of pilot scenario. And so I don't know if names are popping into people's minds when they hear that about folks who might be willing to take this on, but I think it would require kind of internal time from OBPS to work with folks about integration of best practices in curriculum and going from there. I mean, of course, if you're talking about a provincial-wide or a nationwide school system integration, that's kind of separate from, but I think in a post-secondary setting, I'm keen to hear people's thoughts if they've had experience with this before of integrating a new kind of concept into a course and what barriers that they've encountered.
Thanks, Talon. Is there anyone else on the panel who would like to add a thought to this? Otherwise, anyone in the room, any of the professors, perhaps, who lecture in this?
Hello, hi, this is Apple. I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of traveling, so I'm in the car now. Can I share my thoughts about the capacity buildings? Actually related to the capacity building and also, you know, when we're talking about ocean decades, so in the next 10 years, many people always, you know, emphasis on the young generation. This is very good, you know, in my point of view, but a lot of time I kind of see that, you know, they overlook the mid-career persons. So actually the mid-career persons, think is the one that can be able to drive a lot of things, and it can be you know, and all those things can be happened right at the end of the ocean's decades. So the young generation is very good, but then mid-career person, because they are in a mid-career, they have a lot of things going on. They have funding, they have, you know, connecting, networking. So a lot of things that we propose for the ocean decades can be done by driving through from this mid-career, my point of view. And the other things that I think many people always and also already talk about, you know, equities, you know, empowering women. That also very important, particular in the side of Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, we still need that, you know, empowering our women to get going for capacity buildings and for the you know, the goal for the ocean decades. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Apple. And yeah, I agree, you know, that mid-career level often gets overlooked, or, you know, and we do need to look at how we can support that. You know, often there's a need for capacity development there anyway, but exactly during this ocean decade where we're going to see people go through the process of being an early career scientist through to mid-career, you know, how can we best enable that? We'll go to Frank, and then I'll open the floor to some of our other members.
Yeah, thanks to the panelists for this conversation. One of the reasons we're having this is I have happened to meet Steve Diggs, who's going to be on this panel tomorrow, actually today in a few hours. And we started talking, and he told me that he's trying to bring some of these ideas into the classroom in one of the major institutions at Scripps. And so I wonder how can we standardize or share some of these best practices that we use in oceanography and then also in data management across the world, so that we do things better, so that our students learn about data management in a common way, and that we use methods in a common way. When I was going through graduate school, nobody taught me about data management in a way that is channeling the data into a database that is common internationally. And So this is, I think, a huge challenge for our community. So how do we do that?
Thanks, Frank. I think that's also what Alan was trying to get at as well. So I think Steve's in the audience. I don't know if he wants to add anything, and then perhaps we'll. So he's running the session in a few hours. Steve, do you want to add anything, and then we'll see if Johanna or Wulan or Virginie want to add anything further.
Well, you asked the wrong question. Do I want to? But I will. And so I think that what Frank is talking about and what we're trying to implement at Scripps, and actually in many of the R1 Research 1 primary research institutions across the country, there isn't necessarily a reticence to incorporate this. It's not, the value of having it isn't recognized in a packed, graduate training program. So it's seen, in sort of a zero-sum game. You're taking away something to do something else. And I think that this gets back to to Jay's question, how do you get it into academic training? You have to prove that there is value. It's not enough, and that was my original question, why bother with capacity development? One of the things that we'll bring up later is the IPCC's report actually says we cannot get where we're going with the people that we've employed in this endeavor so far. So we have to bring in other people, bringing their unique contributions. And to do that, you have to do capacity development. So I sort of gave the answer for why, at least in my opinion. But I think that it has to be, as Frank says, if it's not part of graduate training, it's kind of be like learning calculus, after your undergraduate years. Yes, you can do it, but it'll always be a second or third, or a language that you struggle with. And if we can incorporate these best practices so that they're just part of the scientific enterprise, the workflow, then people will do science in that way, just as they use digital computers instead of analog, that they're using interpreted languages instead of compiled now. It's, if we teach these things, then people will use these common tools. And I think that we have a wealth of information that says that it yields better science and more inclusive science.
Thanks, Steve. There's a couple more questions, but I would just like to open up to Wulan or Johanna to give their thoughts. Or am I putting you on the spot, and I'll rather open up the question? You can decline if you choose to.
May I?
Please go ahead.
Yes, you can go first.
Okay. Well, I see that first of all, I think that Juliet has really prepared very good questions for this panel. I'd like to take in the second question. And I think that this is a very important question on how do we actually sustain institutional capacity as people in the institution change. I find it very important because it is indeed true that usually people come and go, and especially, for example, in Southeast Asia, where the political climate usually dictates or affect the people that are placed in key offices and institutions. So when we train people in local government, for example, when we do capacity development training, we train someone because we equip them with skills, and we expect that person to be able to apply those skills in his job. And in ideal cases, I think it was mentioned earlier that they become extended arms of training on the ground as trainers themselves. And so when they get they get transferred to other offices or institutions, then that cycle gets broken. And this actually points to one of the main challenges in capacity development, and that has something to do with retention. So you build the capacity, but do you retain it? And then that's also somehow related to the sustainability of your efforts on the ground. So I think this is where the co-designing process, as you mentioned, the co-designing for sustainability, the process of co-designing any project or initiatives can address this challenge of ensuring that the impact of a capacity development effort reaches and benefits and stays on the ground. Well, I can think of a good case, tomorrow Hari Mahardika from Tangerang Regency in Indonesia will be joining our thematic session in capacity development, and he will be sharing some of the best practices from his traineeship program with a regional intergovernmental organization in East Asia. I hope you will be able to join us. But briefly, Harry was a rank-and-file government staff before he participated into this traineeship program, and the skills he acquired was put into practice, and it resulted to more efficient implementation of integrated coastal management program in Indonesia. And now he's leading several projects and launched many interesting projects under his leadership. So from that traineeship program, there were institutional coordination mechanisms that are put in place, and this ensured that the person who was trained will be retained in that capacity. And this was made possible through a collaborative process, not only with the beneficiary, but with the organization, with the provider, with the member states, and with the local government unit where Harry belongs. So you can see that that it's all in sync in the whole cycle of this capacity development program, from the selection to application to implementation to monitoring and post-evaluation of the activity. There is the continuous collaborative session, and that somehow ensured that the trainees who return to their offices will remain and will be able to utilize the skills that they got from this activity. I'm not sure if I answered that question, but I think that's one of the best practices that I can think of. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you. That's certainly given us something to think about. Wulan?
Yes, thank you, Joanna, because actually you sort of like opened the discussion about it. Just to add and also mention about the best practice from Tangerang, Indonesia, which actually is very related to the points that I just want to raise right now. It's all just like on the addition to what Johanna said. So I personally, I don't have the experience with the best practices in the capacity development. As I said, I'm like a blank page. It's sort of like very new things for me. But then I managed to get a conversation with someone who, well, actually a few people who are involved in the projects that has been going for like more than 2 decades. And the question is like, what's the recipe? What's the best practice that they can do that? They can do this capacity development. And some of the points that actually, what I can go from this conversation is actually they do, well, first they sort of like target the local needs, so the community needs. And it's sort of like cater to what they need. And that sort of like really adds a value, or actually really strategic points to sort of like make sure that the project itself is sustained and the capacity development itself is really reach the target. And even so, there is like a turnover in the projects, or also the people that involved in the project, but the community, they have the people who actually got the skills, because it's just there, it's just part of the local community. And then what like Johanna said also, one of the real examples, and it is sort of like, again, the same story, that it's sort of like work in sync. So from the probably like in a developing country, or we talk about the capacity development of a community, they got their skills or trained in a certain way, whatever the project is. But at the same time, also people who gave the training that also possibly, for example, involve postgraduate students. Maybe it is not part of the curriculum, but then because the involvement of these students, and it's sort of like, of course, it certainly give the capacity development of the students. That's what I want to say. For example, one of the people that I spoke to, and it is actually, it's very simple, as like, oh, because the project is already like more than 2 decades. So of course, if the person himself basically sort of like spent his whole postgraduate years, got a PhD, and also now sort of like move or progress the career to lead the project. So it's sort of like the same story with what Johanna said. All in all, the point is when we actually really, I mentioned again, the co-design for whatever project, but then it is involved the elements of the capacity development when we cater the needs of the local community. That might one of the key points that make the capacity development could be sustainable. That's probably that what I just want to add to the points that Johanna has raised. Thanks.
Thank you. There's also some valuable thoughts to add to the discussion. I think we've got a few minutes left. I will just, Virginie, do you want to add anything to the discussion, or Talon, anything further, Virginie? And then I'll just look at Anna's question.
To me, no, there's very good point with thoughts around the panel. I was just mentioning about it is certainly a need to have perhaps a training for either data management, how to handle data as well, a certain type of data across institution, and that would be part of the curriculum of if you undertake ocean science at uni, or even like as in high school, or looking at that already, being able to develop those skills, because that's something that often there's a discrepancy between, for instance, biologists versus physicists in being able to handle data and metadata in a standard way. And so that's, yeah, so, and being able to do that on a sustainable way is also being able to teach in a way that the student can teach themselves and others afterwards. So it's kind of like a generation of teachers of ocean best practice, I would say. That's all.
Thanks. Talon, any further?
I'll just add a couple very quick things. Sorry, I noticed in the chat there was some discussion about like postgraduate differences and whatnot. I should have clarified my point before, was largely regarding undergraduate coursework. I think that, you know, at the postgraduate level, it does get fairly flexible depending on what country as well, and same with undergrad, but I think that it'd be probably easier to incorporate in my own mind. But I think that one point that I think is common across what people share is the idea that regardless of the demographic and the people you're trying to engage, there needs to be a way, I think, to bridge the database, the sheer volume of information into kind of a learning hub, and in order to make it accessible for different audiences. And I think that creating specific learning resources as a portion of OBPS would be of great value. Personally, I know people in the lab that would definitely use those resources if they're available.
Great, thank you. It's a bit of a call out to the OBPS there for some action. I think we're pretty much at the end of our time. So I see that Anna did ask a question there, and it's certainly something to consider, but I don't think we've got time to go into a great discussion about that now. But, you know, looking at citizen scientists, and is there a role there? And, you know, how do we train citizen science in best practices? So I think, you know, hopefully one of the other sessions will be able to have a look at that. So thank you to all the panelists, and I hope some of these comments will be taken up in the various other sessions that are happening. And please, yeah, well, I won't advertise Steve's session later because it's the same thing. But if you're interested in this topic, there'll be more discussions there.
Yeah, and thank you, Juliet, and thank you to Virginie and all the panelists. This is just an appetizer for what could go on over the next week or two in trying to really address some of these very significant issues. I certainly would advertise the session coming up, and I would hope that maybe Johanna would consider setting up a cafe or room for further discussion on this topic as we move through the next 2 weeks. So thank you. And what we've heard now, and I'd like to now move forward to the next 2 weeks. What we've heard now is an introduction to the best practices and best practice system, including endorsement and convergence. We've heard a good example in Australia of how these are moving forward. Then we turned to a discussion of the ocean decade and how we can globalize the efforts, and heard that this is extremely important as the decade moves to achieve its goals of sustainability. And then in this session, I think we've just touched upon the importance of the training and the capacity development and so many of the other issues that Juliet had in her list of questions that we could address. With that, I'd like to talk about the next 2 weeks and introduce to you a little bit of how it will work, and then turn to Ben Roberts, who will in fact talk a little bit about the mechanics. So this next session, and it's a theme session, guidance is what we call it. The workshop goals are to encourage, as you heard, the development of best practices, to promote their documentation, and really importantly, to share them widely using the Ocean Best Practice System, the academic environment, the various facilities. This includes developing a framework or a method for establishing best practices in ocean observing and for gaining endorsement of these practices. And we heard that a little bit earlier. Now we're going forward to a number of themes and sessions, and there are close to 20 themes, and there'll be sessions all through the next 2 weeks, and Ben will show you a little bit of the calendar, and it's full. But I want to emphasize that what we're going to in the next 2 weeks is not a series of lectures, but opportunities to meet each other and to discuss things together, and to try and identify key areas where best practices can be developed, where they can work within your communities, in which you can help propagate them. And so the goals of each of the session, or of each of the themes, theme is a higher level and multiple sessions within a theme, are to address the following questions. The recommendations from your theme session on the needs for development of methods and best practices. Where are the gaps, basically, and where are the needs? And this includes recommendations for your community, for our community, recommendations for the IOC's Ocean Best Practice System, and potential cross-cultural collaborations across themes and across sessions and across communities. Now, I want to emphasize that these recommendations that go to the Ocean Best Practice System, and this is the 6th workshop, so we speak from 5 cycles of experience, have been considered, have been adopted, and have helped shape the evolution of the Ocean Best Practice System. And so we in the community who are operating the system and joining with you really take these recommendations very seriously. I encourage you to look at some of the previous proceedings that we have that are well documented, and Pauline Simpson, who is the manager of the repository, perhaps you can put as resources the previous proceedings so people can look at them if they choose. The summary of the sessions, the session recommendations, are to be an output report, which form then the basis of the workshop proceedings that I was just talking about. We're asking the various groups if they can have their outputs available by October 17th, so they can be integrated into the second plenary, which is October 19th. if you look at the calendar, you'll see there are sessions on the 17th and 18th because the calendar began to fill out, and we'll work with those people to do the adaptation for their outputs. Now, the way the themes and sessions will be working, and this is general, each one is its own individual character because each one is designed by its chair and co-chairs. But they have been arranged with both presentations which focus on the themes and basically raise issues, but as importantly, have sufficient time for discussion. And so we really do encourage a dialogue to look at the needs, options, and the paths forward. The output of the sessions then are summarized as requirements and eventually, as I said earlier, recommendation. I want to comment on one other thing. We tried a concept 2 years ago in which we felt that the early career ocean professionals should be fully engaged in the workshops, in the OBPS, etc. And so we asked that each of the sessions have an early career ocean professional co-chair. And that worked very, very well. Some of them became members of our steering group as a result. And this year, we're also asking that the sessions include early career professionals for the discussions, but also to help with the management of the sessions. My last comment is that there will be many things which we want to talk about that either were in the sessions, but we didn't have time, or we'd like to engage with different people. And so Ben Roberts has offered cafe sessions, he'll talk about them in just a moment, where you can have cross-pollination between themes and talk about best practices, and in reality, socialize and meet people. And the experience with those has been, they're really, really exciting. As some of our colleagues say, they're awesome. And so we invite you to join us in that, and we'll be happy to work with you over the next 2 weeks if you have any questions that need addressing during the workshop. Ben, I'd like to turn to you, and then we can open the floor for a few minutes for any final questions. Ben?
Thank you, Jay. Yeah, I think you covered the cafes pretty well. The only other thing I would add is another way you can use them is if you want to continue the conversations from a session, if you didn't have time within that session, you could make a plan to meet up at a cafe, and then maybe others will join you as well. And we should be able to spread the word about that too, if you let us know. So it's just a more flexible way to have some conversations as well as to network and to do some cross-pollinating among the different themes. So what I'm going to do now is give you a bit of a tour of some of the technology. If you need any help with this, again, I'm putting the link in the chat to our tech support document, which gives you multiple ways to get a hold of me and also my colleague, Joe Mann. I think our preference would be to use the WhatsApp group that we have there, but there are other options as well. And that document is also linked to inside of KikoChat. So hopefully all of you got to this call through the KikoChat platform. That is how you're going to need to access all of the theme sessions, as well as a bunch of other resources that we've aggregated so that the KikoChat platform is really your home base for everything. We did share the Zoom link just for this call with a few people who were having trouble getting on. But in that tech support document I shared, there's more information about how to get onto KikoChat. So I'm not going to cover that now. I'm going to assume you're able to get there. You can get onto this at any point in time. It's open 24/7. So you can practice joining different Zoom calls, moving around in the space, etc. So here we're looking now at the initial view that you'll see when you enter into the workshop to participate. So we're in what we call today the plenary room, or you could call it the main room, and the cafes will also be happening here, as well as the plenary 1B and then the 2 closing plenaries. And within each of these workspaces, so there are multiple spaces. You can see on the left here, each of the themes has their own workspace. Interestingly, somebody You see the little red video icon that indicates either somebody's there live or maybe that they were there and they left and they haven't joined another space. But all the spaces are here, all the different themes, and we'll look at one of those rooms in a second. But let's just stay here in the main room. So in each of the rooms, you've got a welcome document that will be the default that you see. And this is just an embedded Google Doc. Don't be confused if you see something over here that says sign in. This is where it shows that you're actually signed into KikoChat. And some of these are editable and some are not. And then the other thing you'll see at the top of the screen here above that embedded document or whatever other feature is embedded there are a set of tabs. And they're slightly different here in the main room, where we also have these clocks that show us that it's almost 2 o'clock here on the East Coast in the morning, and various other tabs. We'll look at a few of these. And let's see. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So the team up calendar, this is the simplest way to access and to see all the different sessions that are going on, and it's embedded within KikoChat. Each of these embedded things also give you the option to pop them out into a separate window. And so sometimes you might find that's a little easier than looking at it in the embedded form. You can also make a little bit more room here. You see this little button here. If I click that, it just hides the rooms. And now I've got a lot more room to look at the calendar. We'll go over the calendar more in a minute. If you want to get that side view back, you click all rooms here. I just want to show you the other tabs. So we have the overall workshop agenda embedded on here. That has some information about code of conduct and other things as well. There is a map of participants, and many of you have put your location on here. So you can actually see where people are from around the world. Quite impressive to see how well distributed this is. There's also a directory, and this is a nice way to get a hold of people. Because you don't have to actually have shared your email address with anyone, but you can search for someone, or it's an alphabetical list. And if you go to a particular person, when you open them up, there's an option to send them a direct message. Well, what I recommend is clicking email. And what that will do is they will see your email address. You don't have to see theirs, and then they can reply to you, and then you're sharing emails that way. And you don't have to worry about we don't have to worry about the security of the email list. Another feature we have is the discussion board. So if you want to try to have a text-based conversation, you're welcome to, as theme leads or organizers, to invite that anywhere. But we did insert this here, and so you can add a new conversation on any particular topic. Maybe it'll just be one of these per theme if people want to do that. And then you can populate that list, and it's just a typical discussion board where you can reply and reply to replies, etc. All the sessions we hope will all be recorded, although we've left that up to each of the theme leads to activate the recording for a couple of logistical reasons. But once those recordings have been made, you will be able to see them here, and there'll be a full list of those recordings, and you click copy passcode, and then that opens up a new thing, and you just paste that in what was just copied there and watch, and you're on your way. And then finally, there's that tech support document I mentioned. Again, it's embedded in here, as well as linked to on the Ocean Best Practices workshop page on oceanbestpractices.org. Let's take a look at one of the theme spaces, and you'll see that they're slightly different, but the same basic idea. And you'll be able to tell that you're in a different space because the welcome doc is going to say what space you're in, and it's highlighted here. And we have different images for the different spaces. And then up here at the top now, there's now a link to the theme synopsis document. Each of the themes have this, except perhaps one of them, data interoperability, and then a notes document. So during your sessions, you're strongly encouraged to have some notes taken. Theme leads, you can nominate groups of people to do that. It doesn't have to be one person. These are now editable Google Docs inside of KikoChat. And so anybody who's here in KikoChat can get into this document and edit it. Again, you can go to the bottom here and pop it out into a separate window. And the way we've set this up, there's a template. So if you're having more than one session for your theme, you want to just copy this and paste it down below so that you can reuse that and just keep stacking these. We want you to have a record of who's participated in each session. So participants can fill that in. and then you can take some notes down here. The other thing then to mention is that each of these groups, each of the themes has a Google Drive folder. And here on the welcome document for all of these, you'll see a link to the main folder within which all the subfolders are contained. And if you go into any one of these, you'll see within that, there's the notes document that's linked to that we were just looking at, as well as the synopsis document, but there are also these other two documents. There's a PowerPoint template and a session report template. So this is the final output for each of your themes. Jay talked a little bit about what's expected here, and you can see that all of this is here for you to complete, including this key set of questions that you're being asked to answer as your final output. I think the only other thing, I think I've covered just about everything in terms of KikoChat. Let's take a look at the calendar. Again, there's a tab within KikoChat to access this, but here I have it open in a separate window. So the first thing to note about this is that it defaults to your local time zone, or at least it should. And if you look down here in the bottom right-hand corner and it's not your time zone, then you can click there, click show all time zones, and then that drop-down list will give you the options to change it. And the calendar should remember whatever your last settings were. So we're looking here at the first week. We're just in the middle of finishing Plenary 1A. 1B is coming up in a little bit. Then the first cafe. Then we've got that first session on capacity building, another cafe, some seagrass monitoring, etc. Most of the sessions are next week. You see the calendar is quite a bit more filled out here. For any one of these sessions, well, let's just start. There are different views, first of all. So I'm looking at the week-long view, which you might find that the list view, or actually the agenda view, this is the most compact view, is a little more convenient for you. And then you can click on any one of these sessions to see a bit more detail. And we encourage you to do this if you plan to attend a session, to go to the blue sign up button here and click that you're participating. And that's just a courtesy to the theme leads to know who's coming, and they can actually capture not only the names but the emails of everyone who's signed up, and maybe that gives them an extra way to communicate with that cohort. So you see a description here again, and this shows you which category it's in. So the categories, the themes are all listed here on the side, as well as the cafes. And there's some filtering because there's so many different things here. Let's say you just want to find, when are the eDNA sessions? So what you can do for that is this toggles to all calendars shown or none. So you can turn that to none and then just select eDNA, and it's probably, there we go. You may have to scroll a little bit. So there are just the 3 eDNA sessions we can see, or you can find the ones for decision trees, etc. Again, that I toggles back and forth. And the other thing to talk about is how to add these sessions to your own calendar. So if it's a single session, you can open that up, and the share button will then open up the option to add it to different calendars. And you just click on one of those and you'll be able to add that session directly. The other thing you can do is add the entire calendar or the calendar just for one of the themes into your own calendar. And you do that through preferences and then iCalendar feeds, and there are instructions here about how to do it, including clicking on that link. And tip, if you want the entire calendar, workshop calendar, you go down here to the bottom and copy all calendars, or you can just select one or more of them and follow the instructions again up here at the top on how to subscribe, and just import that in directly. I think that I've covered everything I had meant to talk about, and maybe we'll see if there are any questions. Again, you have the contact information for me in the tech support document, and so if you need to get a hold of me and go over this further, please do. Also, just look for me sometimes hanging out in the main room, and just during the next week and a half, I'll try to be there a fair amount of the time, and you're welcome to just drop in and grab me. I'll just be working on something else and waiting to see if anyone shows up.
Ben, there's a question in the chat about having your picture in your file so you can see who's attending the various sessions?
It's nice to add a picture, yeah, and you do that in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. I think that KikoChat actually also prompts you when you first come in to do it on the page just before you get to this one. But you can go up here and click Edit My Profile and add a picture. There's a bunch of other questions which we're not really using for the purposes of the workshop. But at least that one would be a good thing to add, and your location. Then you'll show up on the map. That would be another thing to do.
Yeah, and let me just say that none of this is required. Pictures, emails, etc. That's all voluntary, and so you're welcome to do it, but you're not required to do it for participation.
Well, your email is required, but people don't see it. That's the nice thing about the way KikoChat handles that. But you need that to be registered, and your registration is tied to your email. So if you somehow can't find the link in your, to your personal link to go straight in, you can log in as a guest, and you have to use that email though to be let into KikoChat.
Great.
Register.
There's another question for you.
Yes, so recordings are accessed through the KikoChat interface. There is a recordings tab at the top of the screen underneath those clocks in the main room, and in the other rooms, it's just sort of up there at the top. And there'll be a list of all the recordings. As they get processed, we have to activate them within the system, so there may be a short delay.
Okay, and Carl Nettleton asked you a question about continuity.
It does indeed stay alive as a continuing forum. We may disable the video because there is a charge for the use of the video, so we'll have to work that out afterwards, although it's fairly modest, but the rest of the tools can stay accessible. The calendar as well, so potentially, if some of these conversations wanted to continue and you wanted to use that calendar as a way to coordinate, you could do that. The discussion board also can stay open. There's no cost to us for that.
Very good.
Directory too.
Thank you, Ben, and I appreciate your availability over the next 2 weeks. It's nice to have a resource when we get stuck somewhere.
Absolutely. I hope to see many of you in the cafes. I'm not going to be joining any of the theme sessions, but again, I'll do my best to be available whenever needed.
Okay, we're coming up on the closing moments, and I just want to take this opportunity to thank the keynote speakers, the panelists, and also you, the participants, for your questions and for your contributions. And we look forward to joining together for a productive 2 weeks. For those of you interested, there is a plenary available coming up at it's 7 o'clock my time and 1600 Central European time. UTC is 1400, and that will be available in about 8 hours, 7 hours. And we certainly welcome your participation, but more important, we welcome your participation in the various theme sessions coming up. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.